Welcome to DC Insiders, where we bring you sharp views about global issues with relevance to Taiwan from the political capital of the world here in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Wenchi Yu. The Trump administration's new Pax Silica initiative, shifting AI chip export controls, and the still unresolved Section 232 probe of semiconductors are reshaping how Washington manages technology, security, and alliances. Taiwan, home to TSMC, and the core of the world's advanced chip and AI hardware manufacturing, is central to this shifting strategy. Today, we're speaking to Gregory Allen, Senior Advisor of CSIS AI Center and a former Director of Strategy and Policy at the Department of Defense Joint AI Center, to examine how Trump 2.0's AI and semiconductor strategy affects Taiwan's security, economy, and role in a tightening U.S.-China tech rivalry, and its path forward for resilience in a fractured global tech ecosystem. Welcome, Gregory.
Great to be with you.
Wonderful. So the Trump administration just announced this Pax Silica initiative to, I'm going to quote it, to build a secure, prosperous, and innovation-driven silicon supply chain. The inaugural countries, there are 8 of them. And to Taiwan's surprise, it's not included. Do you know what's the reason?
So the government actually did list Taiwan on its list of partners. So there are the members of the Pax Silica initiative, and then there are the partners. The difference is not explicitly stated at this stage, but I do think if I had to speculate, and here I'm only speculating, there are many international organizations where Taiwan is not treated as a full member, and sometimes that is not just because of U.S. preference, that is because of the preference of other members who are worried about upsetting China. And so if you look to the membership there that is listed, it is most of the most important countries in the global semiconductor supply chain, except for China, and except for Taiwan. And I think Taiwan's lack of inclusion is probably at the request of some of the other member countries who said, we do not want this to infringe upon our diplomatic stance as to whether or not we recognize Taiwan as an independent country or part of China.
What do you think this initiative is about? What's it trying to do?
I think there are 2 sort of wake-up calls related to the importance of semiconductor supply chains that have happened in recent years. The first, I would say, comes from the COVID-19 pandemic, when there was a dramatic shortage of semiconductor chips across many industries. And this was just a supply chain disruption brought about by the pandemic and shifting purchasing patterns associated with the pandemic. So, for example, U.S. automakers were assuming that there was going to be a massive global recession, and so they canceled many of their orders from their semiconductor suppliers. And then, when it became clear that actually car manufacturing was going to bounce back alongside rising demand, well, it turned out that the world had also gone digital, and they were doing their work from home during the COVID pandemic. So there was many orders of laptop computers, telecommunications equipment. And so the automakers found themselves at the back of the line for purchasing semiconductors. And that kind of supply chain disruption, the U.S. Department of Commerce estimated that it shaved a full percentage point off of U.S. GDP. And U.S. GDP in a good year might grow 2 to 3%. So you're talking about cutting U.S. GDP growth in half just because of a shortage of semiconductors. That was a real wake-up call in the United States. The second wake-up call, I think, came from China in recent months when they announced significant export controls on rare earth minerals. These are important for the manufacturing of semiconductors. They're important for many industries across the global economy. And when China said we are going to restrict supply to those who displease us based on our foreign policy, that was also a significant wake-up call to the global community. And so the Pax Silica initiative is trying to look at the entire supply chain of semiconductors, all the way from the minerals in the earth that we mine in order to become the raw materials for semiconductor manufacturing, to the equipment, to the chips themselves, to the data centers that we assemble or computers that we assemble out of those computer chips. And we essentially wanted to say, how do we prevent a repeat of the COVID-19 pandemic with a reliable supply chain? And how do we prevent Chinese economic coercion with a secure supply chain? And so these are the inaugural countries that are participating in this Pax Silica initiative, trying to work together and find ways to build resilient, secure supply chains.
Obviously, you need all the allies on board. So countries like Japan, South Korea, Netherlands, Taiwan, etc., they all need to be aligned. But what do you see the remaining gaps? Because, they're clearly not every company, especially in those countries, is aligned with the U.S. national security interests or economic interests.
Well, as the United States government often says, we negotiate with countries, we do not negotiate with companies. And so we've seen at various times the executives of multinational corporations express opposition to policies that their governments nevertheless endorse and enact laws and regulations and strategies in line with. And so I think that is going to be the move here, is to try and ensure that countries do what needs to be done to make sure that their companies do what needs to be done for secure and resilient supply chains and semiconductors.
We have seen that, moving from Biden administration to the Trump administration when it comes to advanced AI chips. There's been a lot of back and forth in terms of what advanced chips can be sold to China. Let's use Nvidia as an example. More recently, the president himself approved the use or the sale of Nvidia's H200 chips to China, even though it's not the most advanced chips. What is your view on that? And why do you think Trump is making this decision?
So to begin, Donald Trump, in his second term as president, his first move on this issue was actually to be more restrictive than the Biden administration had previously been. They restricted the even less advanced H20 chip.
Yes.
And when we're talking about NVIDIA nomenclature, H denotes the Hopper generation of chips, which was the most advanced, the most state-of-the-art until December 2024. So this was the best chip on earth you could buy 12 months ago, and it's still enormously in demand. To give you an example from a competitor of NVIDIA's in the AI chip design space, Google, which makes its own TPU chips, or I should say designs its own TPU chips, TSMC is the manufacturer, they recently stated that their 7- and 8-year-old TPU chips are still fully utilized in their data center.
We're early in the cycle is what I would say, certainly relative to the demand that we're seeing. Our internal users are, we've been building TPUs for 10 years, so we have now 7 generations in production for internal and external use. Our 7- and 8-year-old TPUs have 100% utilization. Oof. Right. And that just shows what the demand is. Everyone would, of course, prefer to be on the latest generation, but whatever they can get. So this tells me that the demand is tremendous, but also who we're turning away and the use cases that we're turning away.
That is how extraordinary the demand for AI computation is in the world right now, that even chips that are very, very old are fully utilized, fully subscribes, because demand is that rampant. Well, it's that rampant in the West and around the world, and it is also that rampant in China. And what we've seen is that because of these export controls on AI chips enacted by the Biden administration and continued by the Trump administration, although with, as you said, some back and forth on where exactly to draw the line, the leading executives of China's leading AI companies, companies like DeepSeek, which is probably the most advanced AI model developer in China, or Tencent, which is a giant in cloud computing in China, senior executives at both of those firms have said the number one thing holding back their progress in AI is these AI chip export controls. And it's because there are no logic chip manufacturers in China that are as sophisticated as TSMC. There are no logic chip designers as sophisticated as Nvidia, and there are no equipment manufacturers as sophisticated as companies like ASML or Tokyo Electron.
So why does the US president would approve to sell those more advanced chips to China if the goal is to make sure that the China is not going to catch up with the US on AI advanced technology?
So to be frank, I think it's a strategic mistake allowing the sale of these advanced chips. The Trump administration has a hypothesis for how this is actually helpful to national security. And the stated rationale is essentially that China is catching up in chip design, they're catching up in chip manufacturing, they're going to spend tens of billions of dollars building out AI data centers, whether we sell it to them or whether we don't. And so we might as well make some money on it and make them dependent upon our chip ecosystem. Now, again, I think this is a strategic mistake. I think China has made it crystal clear with a decade of policy that they are committed to decoupling from the United States in advanced technology. And I think what this policy unfortunately is doing is making it more convenient and less painful for them to pursue that strategy, which they will nevertheless pursue relentlessly.
But if you speak to Jensen Huang, who's the founder of Nvidia, as you said, right, he thinks that having Chinese companies be dependent on most advanced Nvidia chips, or less advanced even, is actually a better strategy for the US to ensure the US leadership in AI technology advancement. If I analyze it, the assumption is that the gap is still so large that Nvidia is not so worried about Chinese companies catching up. So what does that say about the debates in Washington, D.C. right now in terms of balancing, again, business interests and national security?
So I want to emphasize that I believe Jensen Huang is wrong, not just on U.S. national security grounds. I think he is wrong on what's best for Nvidia. So his claim is that export controls are hurting his company by saying that, we're not viewed as a reliable supplier, we're losing market access, we're strengthening the incentive for China to indigenize. In reality, China made its decision to part ways with Nvidia before this export control strategy ever came into effect. Xi Jinping has been committed to technological self-reliance since he assumed power in 2012. And we saw that with the 2015 Made in China 2025 strategy, which set specific numerical goals for de-foreignizing their tech supply chain in advanced semiconductors and associated sectors. And we saw it again in 2020 with the 352 plan, which this was during a time when Nvidia could sell whatever they wanted to China. And what was China's policy? It was to get rid of Nvidia. The 352 plan gave all government ministries and all state-owned enterprises only 3 years to eliminate American semiconductor technology from their supply chain. So when we were willing to sell everything, their policy was use it as a gap filler, but ultimately we are going to go our own way. And I would put it another way. Nvidia is destroying its own future addressable market share because no matter what America does, in 5 years or 10 years, China is not going to be buying Nvidia chips. So the key question then becomes, what share of the global market are Chinese companies?
Why do you think, again, Nvidia would make such a decision?
I think there are two theories here. The first is a short-term versus long-term trade-off. It is unambiguously the case that Nvidia is going to make a lot of money in the short term. There are Chinese companies where there is a line around the block for these types of chips. The second thing that this does that is convenient for Nvidia, which is going to sound kind of counterintuitive, but bear with me, is it weakens the American customers. If you are a monopoly supplier, what you dread is a monopoly customer, because that means that your customer has almost as much negotiating leverage as you do. If Nvidia had hypothetically wanted OpenAI to win the AI race back in 2022, they were in a position to do that by selling OpenAI all the chips they were willing to buy. Instead, they restricted the amount of chips that OpenAI had access to, allowing other companies like Anthropic, Google, and others to catch up.
Diversify, basically.
Exactly. So now there are more customers trying to buy those chips, bidding up the supply price, and also making Nvidia more essential to a broader ecosystem where everybody invests in Nvidia's chip and software stack.
Now let's take a quick break. You're watching DC Insiders on TaiwanPlus. We will be back in a moment.
Is there a place you've been searching for?
We bring you stories,
not just to Taiwan,
exploring the issues that matter to you.
This is a journey that will move you. Our stories are all connected. TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back to DC Insiders. Today we're speaking to Gregory Allen of CSIS. I think in Washington, D.C., we're seeing efforts trying to still restrict those sales. And, I think the Senate just introduced, it's called Secure and Feasible Exports Act, which would...
The Safe Chips Act, yeah.
Yeah, SAFE, which would bar the export of chips to countries like China and Russia for at least 30 months. Do you think efforts like that would pass? And would that do anything to restrict what the administration will do?
So I'm hopeful that it will pass. I actually testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee several weeks ago on this specific issue. And I think it makes a lot of sense to draw the line where the Safe Chips Act does, which is not allowing these more advanced Hopper generation of chips, but allowing the sale of the less advanced chips. I think giving remote access to Chinese companies is directly against America's interests of winning the AI diffusion race, which is to say, if we want the world to be running on American AI models, then why are we giving China the computing power they need to train models that are almost or as good or better? So if we are thinking about all the market that is going to exist and grow over the next 5 years and 10 years, this is a critical window of opportunity to leverage our compute advantage, to build incredible businesses, to build customer relationships. And all that we are doing by renting this capacity to Chinese companies is building them a bridge to a future that they have stated absolutely will not include us. That, to me, strikes a reasonable balance given where we are in the economics, politics, and national security of the situation. But it passing at this particular political moment is quite difficult. I think many Republicans in the Senate and the House are in sort of a weird contradictory position where they feel certain that Trump and his relatively low approval ratings are likely to drag them down in the upcoming midterm elections. But until the primaries, where the Republican Party votes for who's going to be the nominee for every House seat, for every Senate seat that's up for re-election, that is a very, very difficult time to be seen in loud, prominent opposition to Donald Trump. And so while I find it difficult to see how this bill would pass before the midterms, I'm hopeful something like it could pass afterwards. Unfortunately, it's very clear that China is probably going to buy all the chips they could possibly buy in the meantime and stockpile as much as they can. They did that in earlier iterations of the export controls.
More recently, we saw the news about a Chinese chip maker, More Threads, which designs GPUs, just went public, and its shares surged about, fivefold. And so, to quote the Wall Street Journal, it described the company as China's answer to Nvidia. How much do we really know how competitive Chinese companies are these days?
I think we know a lot, to be perfectly honest. And if you ask yourself, will China catch up to where Nvidia and its critical manufacturing partner TSMC are now? I think undoubtedly at some point China will reach where we are today in 2025. The question is, where will we be when they catch up to the 2025 level? To give you an example, SMIC, which is the preferred manufacturing partner for advanced logic chips of Huawei, they are still making 7-nanometer chips. TSMC was manufacturing 7-nanometer chips in 2019 at volume. And SMIC is really struggling because the depth of the supply chain in the semiconductor manufacturing equipment ecosystem is really just not anywhere close in China to what it is in the global state of the art. And this is a massive technological mountain to climb for China. So it's a bit like reconstructing a puzzle. If you imagine all the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are missing, it's very, very difficult to reassemble. If there's only one piece that's missing, it's very easy to reassemble that piece. But what we've done with these export controls is restricted China's access not just to Nvidia chips, but also to ASML's lithography machines that are used to manufacture those chips, to Tokyo Electron's deposition and etching machines, and on and on.
Supply chain.
There's a whole supply chain, and it's worth emphasizing that many of these machines can very justifiably be described as the most complicated machines the human species has ever constructed. It's a very, very tall mountain for China's technology ecosystem to climb. And I think it's worth pointing out that in 2022, SMIC was manufacturing 7-nanometer chips. It's 2025, it's about to be 2026, and SMIC is still stuck at 7-nanometer chips.
Now, let's talk about what President Trump announced in the very beginning of his term when he returned to the White House about Section 232 investigation into semiconductors.
That's right, but the tariffs will be in place in the not distant future because, as you know, like we did with steel, like we did with automobiles, like we did with aluminum, which are now fully on, we'll be doing that with semiconductors, with chips, and numerous other things. And that'll take place in the very near future.
It's been almost a year. What's the holdup from what your understanding is?
Well, I think it's important to just put this in context of what 232 is and why the administration is interested in it. When the White House enacts, for example, tariffs or import restrictions of any kind on a product, there are different legal authorities that they can draw upon. Most of what Donald Trump was doing in this second administration in enacting such broad-based tariffs was justified under the legal authorities granted to him in what's called IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. Section 232 comes from a different part of American law and has a greater administrative burden for reaching conclusions that would justify retaliation of some kind, for example, tariffs or other import restrictions. So, whereas with IEEPA, President Donald Trump can simply say, I have made a determination, I have decided that we will enact tariffs because this is an economic emergency and this is what's best for America. But with Section 232, there is a formal administrative process, and if you do not go through that process, then you are not granted those legal authorities. So there's a lot of T's to cross, I's to dot procedurally in making this happen. And then at the end of that story, there's also politics and trying to figure out what is the right move at this moment. I think the Trump administration is very heavily focused on the large-scale trade deal that they are pursuing with China at this time, and they're not wanting to drop anything that's going to get in the way of that being realized.
But how does that tie to semiconductors then?
Well, semiconductors are now in Washington, D.C., viewed as a strategic industry in the same way that steel making is viewed as a strategic industry, or oil and gas are viewed as a strategic industry.
So is there a lot of disagreement right now internally, potentially in Washington, D.C. when it comes to like what do they want to do with semiconductors?
Yes, and I think we saw many of these disagreements come out when the Trump administration was enacting IEEPA-based tariffs that could potentially reap consequences for the semiconductor industry. You saw global CEOs like Apple's Tim Cook coming in and saying why iPhones needed to be exempted from tariffs for various reasons. And there's a big AI data center build-out going out in the United States right now. In fact, the top 7 or so companies are expected to invest $450 billion in CapEx in 2026 alone, which is an astonishing amount of money. And because so many of the semiconductors that power those data centers are designed by American companies but manufactured in Taiwan, then an increase in tariffs on those chips could potentially raise the price tag from $450 billion to considerably more. Now, some would say, well, that is what we need as an incentive to drive renewed manufacturing in the United States. But others would say, really what we need is AI leadership to be preserved, and we need to build this out as fast as possible.
So it sounds like there's still disagreement, and clearly, I mean, it's a pivotal moment for the United States, both wanting to have AI leadership as well as manufacturing. So it sounds like hopefully right decisions will be made, even though it's taken longer than it should. Is there a way that we can think about advancing AI leadership for the world without thinking about it has to be a competition with China?
So I think I would point you to a quote from the Google DeepMind CEO, Demis Hassabis. And what he said is that he believes that AI is going to be 10 times more significant than the Industrial Revolution and unfold 10 times faster than the Industrial Revolution. I think we all know from world history that Great Britain's winning the Industrial Revolution had pretty significant consequences for geopolitics over the next 100 years. And the leaders of the world, as a general rule, are not dumb. And they are also paying attention to this fact. And so while it's nice to believe that we could separate issues of technology and geopolitics, it's very tough to see how you would do that in the current moment we're in.
Let's hope that this competition is constructive and healthy and doesn't spiral into something negative and even confrontational. But thank you so much, Gregory, for joining us today and helping us unpack a lot of the most, I would say, the hardest issues now in Washington, D.C., where business interests, economic interests, and national security interests all intersect. Is a big topic for the world today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching DC Insiders. Please follow us on social media to get the latest episode. See you next time.